Today, my guest is Jenny Lisk. She is the host and creator of the Widowed Parent podcast. It's been featured in the Washington Post and on Parent Map. And she's from Washington State. And she is now currently writing her first book, which is very exciting. But I want to talk to her about widowed parenting, because this is an area that I know a lot of people who are widowed. I know a lot of people who are widowed parents, but my grief experience is completely different from that of a widowed parent. So Jenny, thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, of course. I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So first of all, I guess we should start with your story and how you came to be the host of the Widowed Parent podcast.
Yes, that's a great question. How much time do we have here? So I actually, the crazy thing, it was 5 years ago right now that my world kind of started crashing down on me. What is it? It's August now? I was going to say July. Time flies in a pandemic, right? It was actually May of 2015. And my husband, who had been perfectly normal, like nothing seemed wrong, all of a sudden said, I've been feeling a little dizzy sometimes. And just out of the blue, but it was so minor, right? It was like, okay, dizzy, right? You get it checked out, didn't really seem like a big deal. And I should say our kids at the time were 8 and 10. So we just had a normal life. Both of us had jobs, the 2 kids, the dog, soccer, whatever. And long story short, I started noticing over the next 10 days or so, just some really odd cognitive, slight confusion. But he was mostly normal. So I was kind of second guessing myself, right? Am I overreading this? What's the deal? Anyway, he went into the doctor, just the general, we both went in together, his regular internal medicine, to say, hey, what's the deal here? And the doctor said, let's get an MRI of your head. And, they sent us downstairs. And you know how when you get MRIs, I've had them for my knee, right? Surgery,
Right.
whatever. They say, okay, come, well, you'll be here. It'll take an hour. Then go home. We'll call you in 24 hours, whatever. So they told us that. Well, at the end of the hour, they said, actually, don't go home just yet. Why don't you go upstairs? The doctor wants to see you now.
Oh.
So, yeah. So I'm like, okay, well, I don't know what this is, but this isn't how they usually do these things. So there's something bad. So we go back up to his office and he says, there's something really wrong with your brain. I don't want to scare you. It might be glioblastoma. Meanwhile, I'm like, what's glioblastoma? I never heard of that. Turns out it's a super aggressive form of brain cancer. You need to go see the neurosurgeon tomorrow. And so that was the start of the whole journey. And we saw the neurosurgeon the next day, and he said, we're doing brain surgery tomorrow, the following day.
Wow.
Yeah. So we went, from everything was fine to now your head's being cut open, and this is a huge crisis, in just a matter of a couple of weeks.
Wow. I'm so sorry. And so did he have a long battle with this? Did he make it through the surgery?
He did. It turned out it was, I guess you would call it inoperable. I mean, they had the surgery. The objective was to remove as much as they could and to get a sample for a biopsy. And it turned out they could just get a sample for a biopsy. And it was not, like you'd imagine a tumor. You'd hope you have something that you could cut around and remove. But it wasn't that type of tumor. It was more like these cancer cells all throughout his brain. So they did a biopsy and they said it is cancer. At first it might have just been a tumor, right?
Right.
A brain tumor is bad,
Right.
but there are different types of brain tumors and some of them can be dealt with. But as it turned out, it was this very, very aggressive. And apparently this type of cancer, this type of tumor can spring up from like almost no presence in your brain, like a couple of cells or whatever, to a big tumor that's impacting everything in a matter of weeks.
Wow.
So that's how fast, that it grows. So they told, well, I was going to say us, he didn't want to know. They told me that, because I wanted to know, that the average life expectancy was 13 months. And he actually lived about 8 months from the time of the diagnosis until he passed away.
I'm so very sorry. I'm so very
Thank
sorry.
you.
So
Yeah.
you're just, you and your children are just immediately thrown into, deep waters. And,
Yeah.
trying to navigate this alone. So
We,
yeah. So tell us about that part of the journey.
well, I was going to add, I was kind of immediately thrown into the role of a single parent
Mm.
from that first surgery, and it was because he had such a difficult 8 months. Um, all of the ways that the cancer was affecting him cognitively, plus all the number of times he was in the hospital and in the emergency room and multiple surgeries and this and that and the other thing. I was immediately trying to parent 2 kids by myself and care for him. I was his caregiver for 8 months. And fortunately, my work was very accommodating and let me kind of quietly, take time off. And I had a tremendous amount of help from family and friends in the broader community here, the kids' school community and neighbors and so forth and so on. But from the beginning of when he got sick, then continuing through after he died, I think that one of the hardest things for me was how do I parent my kids? How does this, now this is going to be a huge impact in their young lives. And when he died, they were 9 and 11. How does this not destroy them? Right? It's obviously going to affect them. It's obviously going to be a major part of their story and their journey. How do they, in spite of that, grow up to be whole, healthy human beings, who are not completely destroyed by this? And part of the problem was I didn't have any experience with this kind of, parenting when you have a major, unusual, challenging, devastating, traumatic thing going on, right? Up until then, all my parenting had been normal
Right.
kids stuff, that you go through, toddlers and kids up to the age of 11, right? And part of it was I didn't know who could help me, who could even tell me how to do this, or who I could ask, or who, and you can ask the people around you, but most of them haven't experienced this sort of thing. And so that doesn't mean they're not helpful, that, they are. Sometimes you need somebody who actually knows about childhood grief to, help you figure out kind of what to do. And so that, because I felt so lost, and by the way, I did happen to get some very good advice early on from a friend whose husband actually had died of the same brain cancer.
Oh.
Told me that she had learned from the people around her, I think the professionals around her had urged her to be honest with her kids. And so I kind of adopted that mantra early on, that I wasn't going to try to hide from them what was going on. And in fact, it would have been impossible to hide, because it's not like, they could have been fooled into thinking dad was normal, or, and he ended up being,
Yes.
and he was on hospice at home for the last few months. And so this was all very much, they're part of this, world. And I remember early on, after that first surgery, and then the results of the biopsy came back, because at that point it was still a question: is it cancer? Is it some other tumor? Not cancer. And so we went in and they said that it was cancer, and now I had to tell the kids. And I remember my friend called me up and she said, like that night, right, we had just met with the doctor, and she said, well, when are you going to tell your kids? And I said, well, I don't know. And I think she could tell that I was kind of just hoping to stick my head in the sand and, avoid the difficult conversation altogether. And, fortunately, she really kind of challenged me on it. And she said, well, I should back up and say that I had been blogging on, that Caring Bridge site that people share on when there's a medical crisis or something. And so the principal of the kids' school had asked if he could share the site with the broader school community. And I said yes. And so I had already posted on there, that we'd gotten this diagnosis. So my friend says, well, our kids asked us tonight at dinner We told them it was cancer, and they asked if he was going to die, and we didn't want to lie to them. And we said, yes, we don't know when, but, he will. And my friend said, this conversation is probably happening at dinner tables all across our school community tonight. And you don't want your kids to go to school tomorrow and hear from some other kid on the playground, oh, I heard your dad's going to die. I heard your dad has cancer, whatever they might say, right? She said, they need to hear it from you, and they need to hear it tonight. And I was like, oh, okay, she's right, of course, right? But I was so glad that she called me up and kind of pushed me a little bit on that, because that's not a conversation you want to have.
No, but it is the conversation that must take place to spare them even more pain later.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing, right? Because it was an awful situation, and hiding it wouldn't have made it better, but hiding it might have made it worse if then they thought they couldn't talk to me, or they couldn't ask me questions, or they couldn't trust what I was saying, or they were just scared and by themselves not thinking they could talk to me because of something they heard from another kid. So yeah, it's like, but it being new at this whole grief and challenge and sickness thing back then, I was like, I don't want to have this conversation. Like, no, like, can't I just wait or not? Or maybe if I wave a magic wand, it'll all go away or something. But of course, that's not the case.
Grief has a funny way of forcing us into facing things in life that we and challenging us in so many different ways. And so I'm sure that all of those challenges, sometimes we teach what we most need to know. And through your podcast, you're not only learning, but you're teaching, and you're helping other people who might just now be in the beginning stages of where you are. And maybe to draw on the expertise of people who've been there that can help guide them through.
Yeah. Well, you're exactly right. Right. So after, my husband died, and then I'm like, okay, now how do I do this widowed parenting thing? And I couldn't find a book. I went to Amazon and I typed it in, and I'm like, okay, there's no guidebook. And, like a what to expect when the other parent dies kind of book, and so I was like, somehow along the line, and I wish I could remember how the idea of a podcast popped into my head, but I thought, I could go out and interview different people who have some expertise or knowledge or perspective or reflections or something on some piece of this puzzle. So it's not like there are tons of people doing really good work in different aspects of this. There are grief programs in every community, or many communities, that run children's camps and children's year-round programs, and there are books on different pieces of this, and there are lots of people who are experienced who have reflections. But I thought, what if I could pull this together into one resource for people? And a podcast seemed like a really accessible way to do that, right? So I can go talk to these people, whoever it is. Maybe it's an expert, maybe it's a widowed parent who's 5 or 10 years down the path who's sharing something. Maybe it's a person who's now an adult, and they themselves lost a parent when they were young, and sharing their reflections on how that journey was for them. That I could pull these together, and then my listeners, they don't have to go try to talk to all these people, right? They can just tune in every Wednesday on their phone and say, oh, there's a new episode. Right. And I could kind of stand in the place of my listeners in that discussion, posing questions to my guest on behalf of my listeners, learning myself, as you said, and extracting information or learnings or perspectives that I think my listeners might also appreciate. So it's been really interesting. It's actually been fun, believe it or not. And that might sound like a strange word to apply to a grief podcast, but I find it so fascinating to connect with all these interesting people and learn from them, and then share that. And that has been fun.
It's interesting to learn from these people, to connect with them, and to form this community of shared experience. that we've been there and that we're not the only ones. When I lost my son, I just kept saying, I felt like I all of a sudden got inducted as a member into a club that I never ever wanted to join. But thank
Yep.
God for the other members that helped me get through it, right?
Yeah, right.
And I would imagine that maybe you have something that feels similar to that. And I can understand where you can say, it has been fun, just because you're seeing that people are surviving, that people are living, good lives, even though they've had a very sad, traumatic chapter in it. And that must give you hope for your children, and their lives as they journey through this grief.
Yeah, it does. And I guess I find it awfully satisfying to think about, what are the pieces of this puzzle that would help my listeners, right? So I haven't covered this topic yet, or I read this interesting book on this other topic. That author would be perfect to talk to for my audience. And so that's maybe the fun part too, is thinking about like how to build this into something that it really is a useful resource. And I hear from listeners all the time that they do feel so alone. Maybe they're the only person in their neighborhood or their school community, in their personal circles, who is in their position, who has a child or a teenager and has had their spouse die, the other parent die. They do feel totally alone. And then I think when they tap into the podcast, or maybe they tap into some of the different online, grief groups and things, then they realize that they're not the only ones. And hearing other people's journeys and connecting with them and hearing how they do things, even if their situation is a little different, I think you can still learn from people's journeys. And so, yeah, that's been really, what's the word I'm looking for? Rewarding, I guess, to hear from people that it helps them to not feel quite so alone. And like you said, joining this terrible club, and having, those resources, I guess, help you get through.
So how do you find your guests for this?
Well, you know what? I don't have one way. It totally depends. I'm always keeping my eyes and ears open. I don't know if you can see my bookshelf in the background, maybe a little piece of it. I've got about a gazillion books. And when I see one that looks interesting, if I read a book that is relevant to the topic of grief or the topic of parenting or the intersection of those two, then I almost always approach the author and ask if I can interview them. Sometimes I find my guests through, one type of maybe subcategory, if you want to call it that, people who run grief centers in different communities. And I like to highlight what they're doing, because then if a listener is, for example, this week's episode, one of the guests is a grief center in Los Angeles. I heard from a listener in Atlanta. Actually, I had interviewed Kate's Club there. And this listener wrote to me in Seattle and said, I live just down the street from Kate's Club. I didn't know that it existed until I heard your podcast. And then I looked them up, and turns out she'd driven by, their center every day on her way to school or work or something. And so, but when I interview those grief centers, I want to highlight what they're doing for listeners who are near them, but I always add in another topic for listeners who are not near them, like, to grief in the holidays with a center in California, right? So then we talked about their programs, and then we talked about the holidays as a tricky topic, so that listeners, regardless of location, could get something out of that discussion. And then as far as the other people, if they're people who lost a parent, or if they're widowed parents themselves, I just seem to stumble across them. I just keep my eyes open and I keep a list, and then I approach people and ask. Sometimes people approach me, that's happening more and more as the show is growing, and people will say, I have a new book coming out. It's a memoir on this topic. And then I'll think about whether that's a good fit, and then talk with them if so.
So what are some of the commonalities that you notice that widowed parents go through? Have you noticed any commonalities? I know the grief is individualized, but
yeah. Well, I think that the the piece that I just mentioned about feeling alone is a huge one.
Mm-hmm.
The and by the way, I didn't realize that at first, because as it turns out, just, I don't know, happenstance, I have a whole bunch of widowed parents in my like neighborhood and school community. Like, so the woman across the street from me, the woman 2 doors down from me, the woman around the corner from me, around the other corner from me, another couple 15-minute radius. So I didn't realize that there are people who are widowed who don't, have other people like kind of in real life, close to them. So that theme. Also the feeling lost, I think, is a huge, feeling like most widowed parents are not grief experts. They're not child development experts. They're not, they're parents, and they have kids, and they have the rest of their busy life. And previously they had a parenting partner, and now they're carrying the whole load by themselves, right? And so that sense of like, where can I turn for some answers or some support, or who can help me, I think is a big is a common thing I see. Also feeling like somehow like they have to fix it. And this is something I didn't understand either, right? Like your kid is hurting, and they're sad, and they're grieving because they've lost their dad or their mom. And somehow feeling like you, I don't know, have to try to fix that feeling for them, or talk them out of it, or say, oh, well, it's going to be okay because this or that. And it really helped me to understand that the most important thing is to, let them feel those feelings, and help them feel heard, right? And that if you try to say, oh no, don't cry because, whatever, something, instead of helping them feel better or taking away that feeling, it actually just helps them feel invalidated and more alone. So a lot of those kind of things, I think, are some pretty common concerns and challenges.
Do you talk also about dealing with your personal grief while still trying to stay strong for your children?
Um, some. It's an important topic for sure, and I think people do wonder, like, should I let my kids see me cry, or should I not let them see me cry, or do I, how do I handle that part? And I think it's been, because people just don't know, right? Like, what's helpful or not helpful. And I think that I've learned that, it's okay for your kids to see you cry, that they need to know that you can still take care of them, right? If they see you, if they think that you are, so what's the word I'm looking for? If they think that you're not able to take care of them, that it's going to probably
Right.
scare them more. But
Right.
on the other hand, like, if they think, oh, mom or dad doesn't seem bothered by this, maybe mom or dad is crying in the shower every day, but the kids don't know it, and they think, oh, you know, dad's not sad or mom's not sad, so I have to hide my feelings too, then that's not helpful either, right? So it's kind of a fine line of sharing with them, yeah, sometimes I feel sad, and when I do this or that, and that's okay, because some days I feel sad and some days I feel less sad, or whatever, right? And helping them see you learning to manage your grief and your emotions, and helping them see that it's okay to be sad and happy. It's okay to be sad and still, go to work or do whatever, it is you need to do in your life. So yeah, it's an interesting, but it is helpful, I think, to think about that and keep that in mind when you're, interacting with your kids.
Sharing without scaring, I guess.
That's, yes. So you just took my several minute rambling and put it into 3 words that perfectly encapsulates it. Sharing without scaring. I'll have to remember that one. Yes, thank you.
So let me ask you this, because I go into schools and just do basic education of how to recognize grief in students, because a lot of times I think that educators don't realize what's going on. Now, with something like your husband, maybe, and you had the blog, and that That is something, but a lot of families don't do that. And a lot of teachers and a lot of people don't know that there are kids that are grieving in the schools. And so I just try to make them aware of what kind of behaviors, how grief might show up. If they think that it's just going to be crying, then that's not going to happen, because kids want to put on a brave face and they don't
Right.
draw attention to themselves. So it might appear in other ways. Did you see that in your children? Did you see them displaying signs of grief in ways that weren't common to what the people typically think it's supposed to look like?
Mm. Yeah, I think it is important to understand that it doesn't just come out as crying. It can come out as anger. It can come out as withdrawal or being quiet. It can come out as, difficulty with peers, in terms of a lot of kids feel like their peers, their friends, their classmates, maybe they don't get it. They're the only kid, they're the kid with the dead dad, or and then the peers might act weird around them, right? Like maybe they don't want to mention their own dads because they don't want to upset their friend, and which is very understandable. But then someone does mention their dad, and then everyone clams up, right? And then leaving the kid feeling in the spotlight. Or maybe what am I trying to say here? Oh, sometimes kids will say, like other kids will be complaining, oh, my mom is so mean, she made me, clean my room or something. And, leaving the other kid feeling like, I wish my mom was here to yell at me about cleaning my room, so that can be tricky to navigate. And you make such a good point about teachers not necessarily having the training in, childhood grief. And it's something I didn't realize, I guess, until I started talking to people. And there's a whole organization in California. It's the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement. And they have something called the Grief Sensitive Schools Initiative to try to help train teachers, give them some overviews, like a workshop, right? This is what grief can look like. This is helpful, not helpful, here's how to be more grief sensitive in the classroom. And it can even, there can be things like you have the Father's Day project or the Mother's Day project, and then how do you handle the kid whose mom is dead, and do they, do you encourage them to make something for grandma, and then does that backfire or not, or it just can be a whole minefield. So yeah, it's I do think that it can be helpful to talk, I think, openly with their kids' teachers and kind of, let them know what's going on. And you mentioned that I had been writing on the blog, and, with the whole school community reading that, including the teachers, which was wonderful. I think the openness helped them to better understand what was going on in our family, so that then, when they were in the classroom, they could keep an eye out for what was going on.
I think one of the most healthy things, Jenny, and it's something that you're doing, is that we don't talk about death. We don't talk about loss. We don't talk about grief. We don't talk about these things. And yet so many people experience them, and it becomes so awkward, such the elephant in the room, so to speak. And it makes everybody else uncomfortable. Like, one of the things that I devised is the griever's responsibilities. And I know that sometimes people go, what? That sounds kind of harsh. And it's not that. It's that, if you mention your loved one, then it makes it comfortable for everyone to mention their loved one, or to take that sigh of relief and go, okay, all right, we can mention it and we know they're going to be okay. Because the biggest thing I think people are afraid of is that they're going to make it worse for you. And so, but I think ignoring it and acting like nothing happened makes it so much more uncomfortable.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the elephant in the room. When my husband was sick during those 8 months, so he got sick in May, and I was, mostly off work, and of course the kids were off school through the summer. And then when we were approaching September, all of a sudden I realized, like, I was going back to work part-time. The kids were going to be back in school. I would be back in the school building, whether it was just picking them up or going to soccer practice or whatever, right? And I realized there was a huge elephant in the room, and that I would be seeing people at work or at the kids' school that I hadn't maybe seen. Some of them I had seen throughout the summer because they were helping and doing things, but others of them I hadn't seen, and I realized it was going to be super awkward. And part of the reason actually that I realized this, Sheryl Sandberg from Facebook, her husband died right around the time my husband was diagnosed.
Wow.
I think it was shortly before. And so when I first read the news of her husband dying, now my husband wasn't sick yet, and I thought, oh no, that's such sad news, poor Cheryl, right? Well, as soon as my husband got diagnosed, I was like, whoa, I better start following her journey because I'm going to be right behind her, right? Mm-hmm. And she had done a really good post about the elephant in the room and trying to get it out of the room before she had gone back to work. And I realized, I got to tackle this head on. And so I wrote a whole post. In fact, as I'm working on going through my manuscript here, which for this memoir, which is based on the journal, I was just rereading that post. And I think the title is something about kicking the elephant out of the room.
Yeah.
And I kind of went through and I was like, look, if you see us, you don't have to say something profound.
Right.
It's okay just to say, hey, I'm sorry you're going through this. Right? It doesn't have to. And I think one of the reasons that people, and I know I do this myself. And so that's, you're afraid to say something because you don't want to say the wrong thing. Like you said, you don't want to make it worse. And, or you're thinking, well, maybe I could say just the right thing that might actually fix it. Yeah. Right. And so so I would and even writing a condolence card or something, right? I would defer it because I would think, oh, I don't know what to write. So maybe next week I'll think of the right thing. Right. Of course, and you can't fix it. So there's no magic words that fix it that you can write or say to somebody. So, and then I would defer it, thinking, with that lofty objective of finding the right thing to say, never finding it, and therefore never reaching out at all, which then was worse than having just sent off a card with some comments. And I've gotten lost on what your question was, but
but you were talking about the elephant in the room and how you made it your priority to address it.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah. So speaking of condolences card, because I wrote a whole book on this, of just ways that you can reach out and support people that are going through, death, grief, loss of any kind. And, one of the things is, it is sending out cards, sending out condolences. And it's amazing. The one thing I always want to tell people is, look, no magic words exist in the history of ever that are going to make this all better.
Yep.
So that should let you off the hook, that you don't have to do anything profound, right?
Yes, exactly.
And and I don't know whether you agree with this, but the reason that I wrote the book is because during the time that we lost our son, we lost some of our closest friends. And I think it was because it was so close to home. It was so scary. They didn't know what to do or say. They were so paralyzed in fear, or they were so afraid they were going to say the wrong thing. That just held off, and that will ruin relationships. It just will. I didn't want that to happen to anyone else. I wanted to provide people with some tools. So that being said, how I found out about you was through someone else's post on social media that you did a YouTube video on what to put in a sympathy card or condolence message.
I did. Yes. And that actually has been one of my most viewed videos, which has been wonderful. And I think it's because everybody hates writing condolence cards. And it's one of those kind of things that adults have to do. And we're in a pandemic, so more people, unfortunately, are dying. So there are more condolence cards to be written. And this came up because of a chat I was having with a friend of mine who was struggling with what to write in a card for somebody that she knew whose parent had died. And I thought, because I learned a tremendous amount from the people around me who were supporting our family in our time. And I watched what people did that was helpful and what people did that was supportive and what made me, feel a little better and what didn't. And so I tried to pull all those lessons together. And, one of the things that of the gazillion sympathy cards we got, I should say, I never actually looked at the printed card portion. In other words, whatever
Yes.
Hallmark had to,
Look at the message.
whatever Hallmark had to say, with the flowers on the front and the scrolly words and whatever comforting message. And I don't know if I should admit this, so hopefully the people who, sent cards who didn't write anything will forgive me. But I didn't really care what Hallmark said. I just, looked at what, and people didn't have to write anything profound. It could be as simple as, I'm so sorry you're going through this. I'm thinking about you, right? Sometimes the most comforting cards share some kind of memory or other kind of sentimental thing. Like, for example, maybe your friend from childhood, their parent dies or their sibling dies. And if you write a card that says, I always loved doing, I remember how your dad was our soccer coach, and I have such fond memories of those years, right? That is really comforting. And you wouldn't think that something maybe as simple as that would be, but it's knowing that someone remembers your loved one, someone remembers them fondly, someone has that someone thinks of their childhood and their mom who, sewed their Halloween costumes and mentioned that in the card. And, just knowing that someone has that memory of your mom is comforting, right?
Yes, it's a gift. I mean, it's a true gift. It's sometimes a better gift than any flower bouquet that you could send.
Oh, yeah.
Sharing and that memory, that's a treasure. And then it's tangible too, that you can hold on to it if you need it. That's why I love personal cards like that.
Well, and also if let's say you have younger children maybe, and their other parent dies, and those younger children will have some memories, right? But they never maybe really fully came to know their parent as they would have if they had grown up and they had lived. And so you could hold on to those cards then, and then, months and years and decades down the road, those kids then will maybe come to a new understanding of that parent when they read these cards and they see all these people, these friends, these colleagues, these family members, these neighbors who say, I remember this, your dad was so kind, your mom always hosted the best, whatever. That's another way too then that those kids can come to know that person who died as well by reading those down the road.
Well, that they lived, that they made an impact, that they mattered, and that they will be missed.
Yep. And I think the bottom line when thinking about writing whatever you're going to write in the card, it's enough to convey the message that I'm here and I care about you and I'm not running away because this is uncomfortable. And whatever you say that conveys that message, and if you can throw in a memory or a recollection or a compliment about their person was so funny or whatever, I think that's great. That I think that's going to really help the person who is grieving.
Right. And sometimes I like someone that we know lost their mother, but we didn't know their mother. But we wanted to send condolences, and so I just wrote, how blessed your mother was to have all of you at her side when she passed from this life into the next, just to let them know that we know that it was important that she was surrounded by her loved ones, and that, and just something that we could add. Yeah. That could say, her life mattered and she was loved, and we could tell that she was loved just because she was surrounded by those she loved.
Yeah. And sometimes, maybe you could even add, if it's true, like, I love the stories you used to tell about your mom. So, she must have been really funny or really whatever. Even if you never met that person, you might have learned some things about them through your friend and the stories they told, and throwing that in, I think, can be helpful too.
So tell us how we can find your podcast and how often it airs, and about your book coming up.
Yes, definitely. Okay, so it's a weekly show. Every Wednesday there's a new episode. So it's called the Widowed Parent Podcast, and you can find it at widowedparentpodcast.com. And also, of course, on Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts and Spotify and whatever your favorite podcast player is, you can find it there. But on the website, there's, of course, all the show notes and then other articles and resources and stuff. And actually, for anybody who's listening who is a widowed parent, I have a free download. It's jennylisk.com, JENNYLISK.com/top10. With some of the top 10 things that I've learned from my guests on the show. And I think are some of the main, key kind of takeaways that I've learned from interviewing them that I want to share with my listeners, to make sure they can, because you listen, there's 79 episodes now. So if you start at the beginning and work your way through, it's a different topic each week. And, so anyway, there's that. And then for people who are not widowed parents, I have a page for allies. And so the video you mentioned about the condolence cards is there, but also other tips. So jennylisk.com/allies, tips for thinking about how to support the people around you who are grieving. And as far as the book, it's a memoir. It's going to be out in October. So it's not on Amazon or anything yet. Probably the best way to stay in the loop is to make sure you're on my email list. And there's on the bottom of, I think, every page on my website, there's a way to do that. So yeah, I'll be keeping people updated as we get closer. And I'm getting very excited about, launching during a pandemic. It requires creativity. So I've been brainstorming and keeping a little list of some fun ideas there too.
Oh, it sure does. But I know that you will do it. And I know that what you're providing is something that unfortunately many people still need. And especially through this COVID pandemic, more and more parents are going to be needing the advice that you are offering through your podcast. So Jenny, thank you for spending time with us today on my podcast. And thank you for helping so many people.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been wonderful.